Imagine standing at the edge of the Roman world when its marble confidence was beginning to crack. The roads still stretched to the horizon, the legions still carried eagles of bronze and gold, and the emperors still claimed the favor of the gods. But beneath the polished surface, something was changing. In hidden rooms, in crowded tenements, in prison cells thick with sweat and blood, a new faith was spreading through the empire. It had no armies, no senate, no palaces, no banners flying above its shrines. And yet, within a single lifetime, that faith would move from the catacombs to the throne. How did a religion once hunted by Rome become one of the greatest instruments of Roman power? To answer that, you must follow a man who did not simply embrace Christianity. He transformed it into something Rome could wield. This is not just the story of a conversion. It is the story of a civilization in crisis, of an empire desperate for unity, and of a ruler who understood something most men of his age did not. Belief was never only about heaven. Belief could organize armies, silence rivals, legitimize violence, and hold together lands too vast to control by force alone. Constantine did not find Christianity in a moment of peaceful reflection, surrounded by incense and scripture. He found it in a brutal age of civil wars, ambition, collapsing loyalties, and divine competition. And what he saw in it was not only salvation for the soul, but a weapon for the state. To understand why that mattered, you must first enter the darkness of the 3rd century Roman crisis. For decades, the empire had been trembling. Emperors rose and fell with terrifying speed, proclaimed by soldiers one season and murdered the next. Frontiers burned under the pressure of invading tribes. Plague moved like an invisible army through cities and camps. Coinage was debased, trade faltered, taxes increased, and fear settled over the provinces like smoke. Rome was still immense, but it no longer felt invincible. The old pagan order, with its sacrifices, temples, and civic rituals, still stood in stone, but it no longer gave everyone the same confidence. Many Romans still honored the ancient gods, yet beneath that public loyalty, uncertainty was spreading. The empire was searching for stability, and in times like that, the sacred becomes political. Christianity had already become impossible to ignore. It was no longer a tiny sect huddled in the margins of the empire. It had bishops, communities, networks of support, martyrs whose stories traveled faster than decrees, and a moral discipline that fascinated some and alarmed others. Christians cared for widows, buried their dead, collected donations, protected their own, and answered to a god higher than Caesar. That was precisely the problem. Rome could tolerate many cults, many gods, many local devotions, but a religion that claimed exclusive truth, refused sacrifice to the emperor, and linked believers across provincial boundaries looked dangerously like a rival system of allegiance. To Roman officials, Christianity did not merely challenge tradition, it challenged the architecture of obedience. That is why persecution became so fierce. Under Diocletian and his colleagues, the empire launched what later generations would remember as the Great Persecution. Churches were destroyed, scriptures were burned, clergy were arrested, Christians were ordered to sacrifice to the Roman gods or face imprisonment, torture, and death. In city after city, the machinery of empire tried to break the new faith, but persecution revealed something terrifying to Rome. Christianity did not disappear under pressure. It hardened. Each execution produced a martyr. Each martyr produced memory. Each memory produced loyalty. What was meant to crush the church gave it blood, legend, and moral authority. Rome had discovered an enemy that grew stronger when wounded. Into this world stepped Constantine. He was not born in a cathedral, nor raised as the champion of a persecuted faith. He was born into the hard atmosphere of imperial politics, the world of camps, command, dynastic calculation, and divine symbolism. His father, Constantius Chlorus, was a senior military figure who would rise to become one of the rulers of the Roman world. His mother, Helena, came from much humbler origins, and later Christian tradition would wrap her in an almost sacred glow. But the young Constantine's first education was not theological, it was imperial. He learned early that power in Rome was never just seized by the sword. It had to be clothed in legitimacy, wrapped in omen, prophecy, and the appearance of heavenly favor. Diocletian had tried to save the empire by dividing it. Instead of one emperor ruling everything, there would be a tetrarchy for rulers, to senior emperors and to junior ones, each responsible for part of the Roman world. On paper, it was brilliant. In reality, it was only a pause in the struggle for supremacy. When emperors retired, died, or were overthrown, throne, their replacements did not step neatly into place. Ambition returned. Rivalries multiplied. Armies chose favorites. Provinces became prizes. Constantine watched this closely. He spent time in the Eastern imperial court, where ceremony glittered and danger hid behind every curtain. There, he saw something essential. The Roman Empire was no longer held together by tradition alone. It needed a new story, one strong enough to command loyalty across fractured lands. When his father died in Britain in the year 306, Constantine was proclaimed emperor by the troops. That moment was both an elevation and a challenge. He now had a crown, but not security. Across the empire, other claimants advanced their own rights. Among them was Maxentius, who seized control of Rome and presented himself as the defender of the ancient capital. The struggle between Constantine and Maxentius would become more than a civil war. It would become a contest over who possessed the right to rule the Roman world, and more importantly, which god would be seen as backing that claim. Constantine, at this stage, was not yet the simple Christian hero of later legend. He still moved through a religious landscape filled with symbols, solar imagery, sacred signs, and imperial ritual. He understood that men obeyed armies, but they followed destiny. As he marched toward Italy in 312, the stakes rose with every mile. Before him stood Rome, still glowing with the prestige of old empire, defended by Maxentius and wrapped in the aura of ancient legitimacy. Behind him stood years of uncertainty, compromise, and blood. Constantine could not afford a narrow victory. He needed a victory that felt inevitable, a triumph large enough to erase rivals and sanctify his rise. In the Roman imagination, that kind of victory did not come from strategy alone. It came from heaven. Omens mattered, visions mattered, signs mattered, and somewhere on that road, beneath an autumn sky darkening above soldiers, shields, dust, and iron, Constantine encountered the moment that would echo through the next 17 centuries. The sources do not tell the story in exactly the same way, and that uncertainty only deepens its power. Some say he looked up and saw a sign above the sun, a symbol suspended in light, accompanied by words promising victory. Others say he dreamed that Christ appeared to him in the night and ordered him to place a heavenly mark upon the shields of his men. Whether it came as a vision, a dream, a political calculation, or some fusion of all three, the effect was the same. Constantine chose to act. He ordered a Christian emblem to be used before battle. That choice is the hinge of the story. Christianity did not enter imperial history first as a private consolation whispered in a quiet room. It entered under the shadow of war, painted on military shields, carried toward the clash of Roman against Roman. Picture that camp on the eve of battle, fires flickering in the wind, horses restless in the dark, leather creaking, metal ringing softly as men adjusted armor with tired hands. Somewhere, officers pass commands through the lines. Somewhere else, a brush drags a strange symbol across wood and bronze. For pagan veterans, it may have looked unfamiliar, even unsettling. For Christian soldiers, it must have felt astonishing, almost impossible. The sign of a persecuted faith was now traveling at the head of an imperial army, and Constantine, standing at the center of that decision, was making a wager far greater than the battle to come. He was betting that the God of the Christians could do what the old gods no longer seemed able to do: grant unity to a fractured empire, legitimacy to a contested throne, and sacred weight to his ambition. At dawn, when the armies met at the Milvian Bridge, the Roman Empire would not yet be Christian, but it would take its first irreversible step toward becoming something new. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge was not merely a military confrontation. It was theater, judgment, and revelation fused into one violent afternoon. Maxentius held the advantage of Rome itself, the symbolic heart of empire, but he made a fatal choice. Instead of remaining behind the city's stronger defenses, he marched out to meet Constantine in open battle near the Tiber. It was as if history itself had drawn both men toward a narrow stage, where only one story would survive. You can almost see it unfold, banners whipping in the wind, cavalry surging, infantry locking into place, the river glinting like steel beneath the cold light. Then panic, collapse, confusion. Maxentius' forces broke. Men were crushed against the makeshift bridge, thrown into the water, dragged under by armor and terror. Maxentius himself disappeared beneath the chaos, swallowed by the river that had failed to protect him. And Constantine emerged not just as a victor, but as a man marked by destiny. That victory changed everything because victories in Rome were never mute. They had to be explained. They had to be interpreted. They had to be attached to a cosmic narrative. Constantine understood this instinctively. A ruler could defeat a rival by force, but to found a new age, he needed more than force. He needed meaning. The triumph over Maxentius gave him the perfect opportunity to bind his ascent to divine favor, and the God now associated with that favor was no longer one among many. It was the Christian God. From that moment on, Constantine's political rise and Christianity's public elevation became intertwined, not identical, not pure, not free from contradiction, but inseparable. The emperor had not simply survived a civil war. He had found a sacred language powerful enough to recast his rule. Yet you should not imagine that the empire awoke the next morning as a fully Christian world. Rome was too old, too layered, too full of competing loyalties for transformation to happen in a single stroke. The temple still stood, pagan priests still served, traditional rites still shaped civic life, coins and monuments still carried older imagery. Even Constantine himself remained, for a time, a figure who moved carefully between worlds, retaining symbols that could speak to different audiences. But that is precisely what made him so dangerous and so effective. He did not begin by demolishing the pagan order outright. He began by shifting the center of gravity. He gave Christians space, privilege, access, and imperial attention. And in politics, once the center begins to move, everything else eventually has to move with it. In 313, the Edict of Milan announced a new reality. Christianity would no longer be hunted as a criminal superstition. Christians were granted toleration. Confiscated properties were to be restored. Men and women who had once risked torture for refusing sacrifice now found the state recognizing their right to worship. This was not yet the declaration of Christianity as the official religion of the empire, but it was a revolution all the same. The empire had moved from persecution to patronage. A religion once pushed underground was now stepping into the daylight, with imperial protection at its back. And what had changed that reality? Not merely an abstract victory of ideas. It had changed because an emperor had decided that this faith could serve his order better than the old system could. This is the point where you begin to see Constantine's true genius. He did not treat Christianity simply as a personal belief. He treated it as infrastructure. The church already possessed something the empire desperately needed: organization. It had bishops in major cities, regional networks, councils of communication, systems of charity, and a moral vocabulary that could bind strangers into one community. In a fractured world that was priceless, where Rome saw provinces, taxes, and military districts, the church saw dioceses, congregations, doctrine, and spiritual authority. Constantine looked at that structure and saw not a rival to empire, but a framework that could be incorporated into it. The church could help create loyalty beyond bloodline, beyond tribe, beyond city. It could unify where coercion alone failed. This was not merely tolerance, it was political integration. Imperial favor transformed Christianity from within as well. Once bishops had survived on local support, often navigating hostility, scarcity, and danger. Now they could access imperial patronage, influence, and prestige. Constantine funded church construction on a monumental scale. Basilicas rose where humble houses of worship had once hidden. Sacred architecture itself changed, becoming grander, more public, more visibly tied to state power. Christianity began to acquire marble, columns, ceremony, and spatial authority. It no longer looked like the religion of the condemned. It looked like the religion of the future. When believers gathered beneath these vast roofs, they were not only praying, they were entering a new relationship with power. The God of martyrs was being housed in imperial stone, but patronage came with a price, because power never arrives empty-handed. Once the emperor began protecting the church, he also began involving himself in its disputes. And Christianity had many disputes. Beneath the shared confession of Christ lay fierce disagreements over scripture, authority, and the nature of Jesus himself. These were not small matters to the believers who argued them. They were questions of truth, salvation, and the very structure of reality. Yet to Constantine, theological chaos also meant political risk. A divided church could not serve as the unifying force he needed. If bishops were attacking one another, if cities were splitting into rival factions, if doctrine varied wildly from province to province, then Christianity would not stabilize the empire. It would mirror its disorder. That was unacceptable. The greatest of those early crises erupted around a priest named Arius. his teaching spread rapidly, especially in the East, because it addressed a profound and difficult question. What exactly was the relationship between God the Father and Jesus the Son? Arius argued that the Son, though exalted above all creation, was not eternal in the same way as the Father. Others saw this as a deadly assault on the heart of Christian belief. The controversy did not stay inside seminar rooms or among quiet scholars. It spilled into streets, churches, households, and political circles. Christians argued with intensity because doctrine was not decoration. It defined the God they worshipped. For Constantine, this conflict was a warning. The religion he had elevated was now threatening to fracture itself just as it was becoming useful to the state. So he did something no Roman emperor before him would have imagined. He called the bishops of the Christian world into council. In the year 325, at Nicaea, they gathered under imperial authority to settle a theological war. Pause for a moment and consider the symbolism. Only a short time earlier, Christian leaders could be imprisoned, tortured, or killed by imperial command. Now they were summoned by the emperor not to be condemned, but to define orthodoxy. The persecuted had become advisors to power. The empire, once hostile to Christian identity, now required Christian agreement in order to preserve imperial peace. This was not yet the final fusion of throne and altar, but you can already feel the shape of it emerging in the room. Nicaea was not a serene assembly of holy men detached from ambition. It was a confrontation charged with theology, prestige, rivalry, and the invisible weight of imperial expectation. Bishops arrived carrying scars from earlier persecutions, men whose bodies still remembered the cruelty of pagan Rome. Yet they now debated under the protection of a Christian-leaning emperor who wanted resolution, not endless abstraction. Constantine himself was no trained theologian, but he understood governance. He wanted unity. He wanted a creed clear enough to define the boundaries of the faith and strong enough to suppress prolonged conflict. And so the council produced what history would remember as the Nicene Creed, affirming the Son as of one substance with the Father. It was a theological formula, yes, but also something more. It was one of the first great moments in which Christian doctrine was hammered into shape under imperial pressure. That moment matters because it reveals the deeper transformation at the heart of this story. Constantine did not simply legalize Christianity, he made it governable. He pushed it from the margins into administration, from scattered witness into centralized definition, from persecuted conviction into public institution. Once doctrine becomes tied to imperial stability, disagreement ceases to be only spiritual, it becomes political. Heresy becomes not just false belief, but a threat to order. Orthodoxy becomes not just truth, but an instrument of cohesion. In that shift, Christianity gained power, but it also lost a certain innocence. The faith that had once stood apart from empire was beginning to speak in the language of empire, enforce boundaries like empire, and benefit from empire's force. Constantine knew the symbolic value of place as well as doctrine. He poured energy into building Christian monuments at sites charged with sacred meaning. In Jerusalem, churches rose over locations associated with the death and resurrection of Christ. In Rome and elsewhere, imperial resources elevated Christian memory into physical grandeur. This mattered profoundly. Memory becomes stronger when built in stone. Pilgrimage becomes more powerful when guided through monumental space. A religion that once remembered its dead in hidden cemeteries now marked its sacred story. Through architecture visible to the world, you did not need to read a decree to feel the shift. You could see it on the skyline. And still, through all this, Constantine remained a ruler first. He understood spectacle, image, ceremony, and narrative. He understood that to reshape Rome, he needed not only laws, but a new imagination of empire itself. Christianity offered him something the old gods no longer reliably could: a claim to universal truth. Rome had always ruled over many peoples, many languages, many cults, but Christianity carried a message that could cross frontiers and dissolve local distinctions. Under a higher identity, one God, one truth, one emperor favored by heaven. That formula was intoxicating. It offered what every fragile empire dreams of: unity without endless negotiation. And for Constantine, that dream was beginning to look possible. But if you want to understand how Christianity became imperial, you must look beyond councils and decrees and step into the emotional machinery of power. Empires do not survive on laws alone. They survive on symbols that ordinary people can feel. Constantine grasped this with extraordinary instinct. He did not merely protect Christianity as a tolerated faith among many. He began recoding the visual and moral universe of Rome so that Christianity would increasingly appear not as an outsider, but as the natural community companion of order, legitimacy, and destiny. This is how transformations truly happen, not only in books, not only in courts, but in the imagination of millions. A sign on a shield, a basilica on a skyline, a bishop near a throne. Slowly, the eye begins to accept what history had once found impossible. One of Constantine's most decisive acts was not theological at all. It was geographical. He founded a new imperial capital at Byzantium and renamed it Constantinople. This was no minor administrative adjustment. It was a statement of civilizational intent. Rome, ancient and magnificent, carried too much of the old pagan memory, too many aristocratic habits, too many political ghosts. Constantine needed a city that could embody a new age. Constantinople would be strategic, wealthy, fortified, and symbolically fresh. It would face eastward toward the richer provinces and the deeper theological currents of the empire. It would also be shaped under a ruler already aligning himself ever more visibly with the Christian God. You can feel the meaning of that move. It was as if the empire itself was shifting its center of gravity away from the old altars toward a new sacred political horizon. A capital is never just stone. It is a message about what kind of world is being built. In Constantinople, imperial order and Christian prestige grew side by side. The city did not become purely Christian overnight, and traces of older religious life remained, but the long direction of movement was clear. The emperor who had once won under a mysterious sign was now designing a political future in which Christianity would no longer survive in the cracks of Rome. It would stand close to the center of administration, ceremony, and historical memory. That proximity mattered more than any single speech. Once faith begins to occupy the same spaces as sovereignty, it changes in tone, in ambition, in function. It becomes easier for rulers to use it, and easier for believers to imagine power as holy. Yet the transformation was not clean, and that is one of the reasons this story has such weight. Constantine was not a saint floating above politics. He was an emperor formed in violence, and his reign never escaped blood. Rivals were defeated. Family members would later be executed under dark and still disputed circumstances. Court life remained dangerous. Ambition remained ruthless. The Christianization of imperial power did not produce instant moral purity. Instead, it wrapped old forms of dominance in a new sacred language. That is part of the tragedy and part of the genius. Christianity did not conquer Rome by abolishing Roman power. It entered Roman power, spoke through it, and was reshaped by it. The cross was moving closer to the sword, and once that happened, neither would remain untouched. This is where the emotional heart of the story begins to darken. For the early Christians who had admired martyrs, there was always a tension in becoming favored by the state. What happens to a faith born in persecution when emperors begin building its churches? What happens to a religion that once resisted imperial worship when emperors start using it to legitimize rule? You can almost feel the contradiction tightening. The church gained safety, influence, and public authority, but it also moved nearer to compromise, hierarchy, coercion, and political expectation. The same empire that had once burned scriptures could now sponsor orthodoxy. The same throne that had demanded sacrifice could now reward bishops. Victory had arrived, but it did not rive innocent. Constantine also understood the power of law and privilege. Clergy were granted exemptions and benefits that elevated their social standing. Christian bishops increasingly became figures not only of spiritual guidance, but of civic significance. Disputes could be brought before them. Their voices mattered. In the public life of cities, the church was no longer merely a spiritual fellowship floating beneath the state. It was becoming a recognized pillar within the imperial order. This institutional elevation changed how Christianity was perceived and practiced. A bishop was no longer simply a shepherd of souls in danger. He could be an administrator, mediator, patron, and public authority. Once office acquires prestige, ambition follows. Once holiness acquires legal advantage, the nature of leadership changes. And still, Constantine moved carefully enough to avoid a total rupture with the empire's pagan majority. That caution was not weakness, it was strategy. He restricted certain practices, favored Christianity unmistakably, and invested his prestige in the church. But he did not immediately outlaw the old religions altogether. He understood that durable transformation often works by uneven pressure rather than sudden demolition. Too abrupt a break could provoke backlash. Better to redirect status, wealth, ceremony, and imperial intimacy toward Christianity until the older order weakened by comparison. This is how empires absorb new truths. They do not always crush the old world in a single day. sometimes they starve it of centrality until it becomes a relic standing in its own shadow. You can see that process in the changing meaning of public honor. Under Constantine, to be visibly associated with Christianity increasingly meant access to imperial favor, social legitimacy, and the future. Conversion was no longer always an act of danger. It could also become a path of advancement that altered the religious psychology of the empire. Some would convert out of genuine conviction, others out of admiration for the emperor, others out of calculation, others because the tide of history seemed too strong to resist. This is one of the great turning points in religious history, the moment when Christianity stopped being only the faith of the convinced and became, increasingly, the faith of the ambitious, the loyal, the adaptive, and the politically aware. Once that threshold is crossed, a religion ceases to be merely countercultural. It becomes civilization. There was another, even deeper change. Christianity offered Rome a moral narrative the pagan system could not present with the same force. The old cults were tied to place, tradition, civic duty, and reciprocal sacrifice. They upheld the city, the family, the order of inherited custom. Christianity offered something more universal and more total. It claimed authority over conscience, history, death, and eternity. It could tell slave and senator alike that they existed under one judgment and one God. For an empire trying to hold together wildly different peoples, that universalism was magnetic. It allowed Rome to imagine unity in spiritual terms, not merely administrative ones. The emperor could now rule not only as master of territories, but as the guardian of an order that seemed to mirror heaven itself. But universal truth always creates enemies. If one faith becomes uniquely favored as the bearer of divine legitimacy, then rivals become harder to tolerate. Here again, Constantine's world reveals the shape of what was coming. The more Christianity was elevated, the more disagreement became dangerous. Schism threatened not only souls, but stability. Religious plurality, once a practical habit of Roman governance, began to lose its usefulness under a faith that claimed exclusivity. You can already sense the future hardening in the distance, a world in which emperors will punish heresy, close temples, and draw the boundaries of belief with the force of law. Constantine did not complete all of that himself, but he opened the gate through which it would become possible. There's also the matter of his own baptism, delayed until near the end of his life. To modern eyes, that may seem strange for a ruler so closely associated with Christianity, but in his world, baptism carried immense seriousness. It washed away sins, and many feared receiving it too early only to stain themselves again through the brutal compromises of public life. Constantine's delay reveals something about the world he inhabited and about himself. He believed enough to want the sacrament, but he remained all his life a man of empire, burdened by violence, calculation, and the impossible demands of rule. In that late baptism, you can see the tension of the entire age concentrated in one act. The emperor who elevated Christianity to unprecedented heights still approached its deepest rite. As a man who knew power had stained him by the time Constantine died in 337. The Roman Empire was not yet the fully Christian state it would later become under emperors like Theodosius. Paganism still lived, old temples still stood, traditional elites still endured, but the decisive turn had already been made. Christianity had gained legality, wealth, monumental presence, theological definition under imperial oversight, and intimate access to the machinery of rule. It had learned how to inhabit basilicas, councils, courts, and capitals. More importantly, Rome had learned how to use Christianity as a language of unity, legitimacy, and destiny. The transformation was incomplete but irreversible. What had once been the faith of the hunted was now woven into the future of empire. And that is the true meaning of Constantine's achievement. He did not merely protect Christians from persecution. He changed the role of Christianity in history. Before him, it was a persecuted religion growing through witness, suffering, charity, and conviction. After him, it became increasingly capable of shaping law, policy, identity, architecture, education, and imperial imagination. The church gained empire, and empire gained a soul language powerful enough to sacralize itself. This was not simply conversion, it was fusion, and once faith fuses with power, the world is never the same again. If you step back and look at the Roman world before and after Constantine, the scale of the shift becomes almost terrifying. Before him, Christianity was a faith that challenged empire by refusing to worship its rulers. After After him, Christianity increasingly helped empire explain itself. Before him, the church survived because it stood apart from imperial authority. After him, it flourished because it stood near it. That is the paradox at the center of this story. Constantine did not destroy Christianity by embracing it, but he changed its destiny forever. He pulled it out of the shadows and placed it under the light of power, where every virtue grows more visible and every compromise more dangerous. In doing so, he created one of the most enduring alliances in world history, the alliance between sacred truth and political rule. You can trace that alliance through everything that followed. Once bishops sat close to emperors, future rulers would seek their blessing. Once creeds were tied to order, future disputes over doctrine would become matters of state. Once churches rose with imperial funding, future generations would see Christianity not as a fragile assembly of believers, but as one of the pillars of civilization itself. This is how a religion becomes an empire's nervous system, not all at once, not through one battle or one decree alone, but through 1,000 acts of connection, legal, architectural, ceremonial, moral, and symbolic. Constantine began that process with the instincts of a statesman and the audacity of a man who believed history had chosen him. And yet, beneath the majesty of this transformation, there remained a deeper question. Did Constantine elevate Christianity because he truly believed or because he saw its usefulness? Historians have argued over this for centuries, and perhaps they always will. Some see a sincere, if gradual, convert, a ruler genuinely persuaded that the Christian God had granted him victory and purpose. Others see a master politician who recognized a disciplined and expanding movement that could stabilize a dying order. But perhaps the most unsettling answer is that both things can be true at once. Human beings rarely move through history with pure motives, especially emperors. Constantine may have believed and calculated, prayed and strategized, feared heaven, and desired control. In men of power, faith and utility often become impossible to separate. That is what makes this story so powerful. It is not a simple tale of hypocrisy, nor a simple tale of holiness. It is the story of how belief changes when it enters the bloodstream of a state. Christianity brought Rome a new sacred center, a universal claim stronger than local cults, a moral vocabulary broader than civic ritual, and a structure of loyalty that crossed provincial borders. But Rome brought Christianity something equally transformative: administration, scale, law, wealth, prestige, coercive force, and the temptation to govern not only hearts, but societies. When those two worlds met, neither remained what it had been before. The empire was Christianized, yes, but Christianity was also Romanized. You can see the first signs of that Romanization in the way dissent began to be treated. Once imperial power became invested in theological unity, opponents could no longer be left merely to argue. They might be exiled, condemned, stripped of office, or suppressed in the name of peace. The logic is cold, but it is predictable. If truth is tied to order, then error becomes rebellion. If doctrine safeguards stability, then deviation becomes dangerous. This is one of the most consequential legacies of Constantine's age. The church inherited the imperial habit of defining boundaries not only spiritually, but administratively, and over time, that habit would sharpen into something far more severe. Councils would condemn, emperors would enforce, armies, judges, and laws would one day stand behind what had once spread through witness and martyrdom alone. Think of the irony. The faith that once filled Roman prisons would eventually help fill prisons of its own. The religion that once honored those who died resisting imperial decrees would, in later centuries, stand beside emperors issuing decrees against heretics, pagans, schismatics, and dissidents. None of that was completed in Constantine's lifetime, but the pathway opened under him. He made it imaginable for the state to see Christian truth as part of public order. He made it imaginable for bishops to think in civilizational terms. He made it imaginable for power to look holy. That imagination would become one of the defining forces of medieval and early modern history. There is another reason Constantine's transformation mattered so deeply. It changed the memory of suffering. Before imperial favor, Christian identity had been forged through stories of persecution, martyrs in arenas, confessors before judges, communities surviving despite hostility. Suffering itself carried authority, it proved faithfulness. But when the empire began rewarding Christianity, suffering no longer stood at the center in quite the same way. Authority began to come not only from endurance, but from office, not only from sacrifice, but from institutional legitimacy. This was a psychological revolution inside the church. A bishop in a palace-adjacent basilica represented something profoundly different. From a bishop awaiting execution in a dungeon, the first carries prestige, the second carries witness. Under Constantine, Christianity began moving from the second world into the first, and still, to millions across the empire. This transformation must have felt like a miracle. Imagine being a Christian old enough to remember the fear of confiscation, arrest, denunciation, and public humiliation. Imagine hearing that the emperor now favors your God, restores your churches, and calls your bishops into council. Imagine seeing a basilica rise where there had once been only secrecy. Imagine the emotional force of that reversal. No wonder many believers saw Constantine as heaven's instrument for them. This was not merely politics, it was vindication. The God of the martyrs had not abandoned them. He had conquered Caesar, but history is rarely so pure. In truth, Caesar had not simply been conquered, he had adapted. That adaptation may have been Constantine's greatest imperial triumph. Rome had always survived by absorbing what it could not destroy. It had absorbed gods, customs, elites, languages, provinces, symbols, and legal traditions. Now it was absorbing Christianity. But Christianity was unlike the other cults Rome had folded into itself. It made exclusive claims. It demanded ultimate loyalty. It told a story about truth that exceeded the empire. That is why Constantine's synthesis was so extraordinary. He did not merely place Christianity alongside Roman identity. He began repositioning Roman identity inside a Christian frame. The emperor could now appear not only as ruler by force or inheritance, but as a chosen guardian of divine order. That gave the empire a new sacred horizon, one that would outlive Constantine by centuries. And what of the old gods? They did not vanish in a single dramatic collapse. They faded unevenly, region by region, generation by generation, law by law, patronage by patronage. Their temples still gleamed in parts of the empire. Their rituals still held prestige among many elites. Their stories still lived in the language and memory of Rome. But they were increasingly defending a past, while Christianity was claiming the future. This is often how civilizations truly change. The old world does not always fall with a crash. Sometimes it loses the center, and once the center is gone, decline becomes only a matter of time. Constantine did not finish the pagan world, but he denied it the empire's deepest loyalty. That shift would echo far beyond Rome. It would shape Byzantium, medieval Christendom, kingship in Europe, the political language of divine right, the idea of sacred empire, the role of councils, the suppression of heresy, and the expectation that rulers must answer not only to law and force, but to some transcendent moral order publicly affirmed through religion. Even modern states, which often imagine themselves secular and distant from ancient empires, still live among the ruins of that Constantinian settlement. The notion that power seeks moral legitimacy from something higher than itself, the notion that a shared creed can bind a civilization, the notion that public order and religious truth might reinforce each other, these are shadows cast by Constantine's age. So when you ask how Constantine turned Christianity into an empire, the answer is larger than a single conversion or a single battle. He did it by recognizing that faith could unify where armies could only intimidate. He did it by giving Christianity legality, wealth, architecture, and institutional privilege. He did it by making bishops useful to governance and doctrine useful to order. He did it by surrounding his rule with Christian symbolism, while preserving enough imperial continuity to avoid collapse. He did it by shifting the church from survival to administration, from witness to influence, from persecuted minority to partner of civilization. And in doing that, he changed not only Rome, but the entire future of the West and beyond. But there is one final layer to this transformation, and it is perhaps the darkest of all. Once a faith becomes imperial, it no longer only asks how to save souls. It begins to ask how to shape worlds. It starts thinking in terms of borders, institutions, orthodoxy, discipline, civilization, law. It becomes capable of magnificent achievements: art, philosophy, education, charity, architecture, collective identity, but it also becomes capable of exclusion, punishment, and domination on a scale a persecuted sect could never imagine. Constantine did not create all of those futures himself, but he opened the door through which they would enter history, and once that door was open, the church would never again belong only to the catacombs. And that is why Constantine still unsettles history. He stands at the threshold between two worlds, with one foot in the blood-soaked logic of pagan empire and the other in the rising order of Christian civilization. Behind him lies the Rome of sacrifices, imperial cult, and persecuted believers praying in fear. Before him lies the Rome of councils, basilicas, creeds, and emperors who would increasingly govern beneath the shadow of the cross. He did not simply inherit a transition already completed. He forced it forward. He accelerated it, shaped it, and stamped it with his own political instincts. That is what makes his legacy feel so immense. When you look at Constantine, you are not just looking at a ruler. You are looking at the moment when belief stopped being only a matter of private conviction and became one of the organizing engines of empire. But perhaps the most profound question is not what Constantine did to Christianity. It is what he taught every ruler after him. He taught them that religion, when properly aligned with power, could do what armies often could not. It could sanctify authority. It could turn obedience into duty and duty into righteousness. It could bind distant provinces through a shared sacred language. It could transform a contested throne into something that looked ordained. In a world exhausted by civil wars and fractured loyalties, that discovery was revolutionary. It meant that imperial survival no longer had to depend only on fear, taxation, and military discipline. It could also rest on the invisible architecture of faith. Once that lesson was learned, it could not be unlearned. Medieval kings would seek coronation beneath holy ritual. Emperors would present themselves as defenders of the true faith. Heretics would be treated not merely as mistaken, but as threats to social order. Bishops would become princes, monks would advise rulers, theologians would shape policy, and wars themselves could be clothed in sacred justification. The long marriage between throne and altar, with all its grandeur and all its cruelty, did not begin in full with Constantine, but under him it found its decisive opening. He proved that Christianity could do more than survive empire. It could become part of empire's deepest logic, and yet the deeper tragedy is that this transformation was not only external, it changed the inner imagination of Christianity itself. A faith that had once prepared believers to suffer now had to learn how to govern. A religion that had once stood in judgment over earthly arrogance now found itself negotiating with courts, laws, wealth, appointments, and imperial favor. The church did not simply gain protection, it gained burdens. It had to decide what truth looked like when backed by authority. It had to decide how to remain faithful. While operating near the center of power, it had to decide whether winning the world might cost something of the soul that first transformed it. You can almost feel that tension pulsing beneath the surface of late antiquity. In one city, a bishop preaches Christ crucified beneath a grand roof paid for by imperial gold. In another, believers celebrate their new legitimacy, while old temples still cast shadows over public squares. Somewhere, a theologian writes with the urgency of a man defending eternal truth. Somewhere else, an official reads doctrine as if it were a matter of provincial security. The lines between heaven and administration, between orthodoxy and order, between prayer and policy are becoming harder to separate. This is the world Constantine helped create, a world in which spiritual questions would now carry imperial consequences, and that is why his story still feels modern, even now, long after Rome's standards have fallen and its emperors have become dust. The pattern remains familiar. States still seek moral language to justify themselves. Leaders still wrap ambition in destiny, policy in principle, and conflict in sacred purpose. Public life still turns to belief when law and force alone seem insufficient. Constantine's genius was to recognize earlier than most that people do not live by command alone. They live by meaning. They obey more deeply when they think obedience participates in a larger truth. He took that insight and built a civilizational strategy from it. But history does not preserve men by praising them alone. It preserves them by forcing us to confront what they unleashed. Constantine gave Christianity scale, visibility, durability, and state protection at a moment when it might otherwise have remained vulnerable for far longer. He also placed it on a path where compromise with coercion became increasingly normal. Through him, the church gained the empire's resources, and the empire gained the church's sacred legitimacy. That exchange made Christian civilization possible in one sense. It also made Christian domination possible in another. The same fusion that produced cathedrals, law codes, philosophical synthesis, and charitable institutions would, in later centuries, also help produce persecution, exclusion, holy war, and enforced conformity, such as the double edge of power. When it learns to speak in the voice of God. So was Constantine the savior of Christianity, or the man who forever entangled it with empire? The answer, once again, is both. Without him, Christianity might still have triumphed in some form, but not in the same way, not with the same speed, not with the same political shape. Without him, the Roman state might have continued persecuting, tolerating, or gradually absorbing the faith by slower and more uncertain means. But with him, the process was compressed into one age and directed by one astonishingly capable ruler. He did not invent Christian belief. He did not invent Rome's hunger for unity, but he fused them at the level of statecraft, and in doing so, he changed the architecture of history. Look once more at the image that began this transformation. A sign lifted above battle, a symbol carried on shields, a promise of victory tied to divine favor. In that image, the entire Constantinian revolution is already present. Christianity enters the age of empire not first as a monastery, not first as a sermon, not first as a hidden prayer whispered in fear, but as a mark born into war by an emperor seeking the world. That is why the story has never lost its force. It contains triumph and danger in the same breath. It is a story of vindication for the persecuted and warning for the powerful. It is a story about what happens when heaven is invited to legitimize the ambitions of earth. And yet, for all the armies, councils, laws, and monuments, perhaps the deepest transformation Constantine achieved was one of memory. After him, generations would remember the rise of Christianity not only as a spiritual phenomenon, but as a civilizational turning point inseparable from imperial destiny. The faith of fishermen, widows, martyrs, and bishops would be redoled as the faith that inherited Rome. That memory would become one of the foundations of Europe, Byzantium, and the Christian political imagination for more than 1,000 years. Constantine did not merely change policy, he changed the story civilization told about itself. So when you ask how Constantine turned Christianity into an empire, the answer is this: he saw that Rome could no longer survive on old gods and old loyalties alone. He saw in Christianity a disciplined, universal, morally charged force that could outlive civil war and outbind regional division. He legalized it, favored it, monumentalized it, organized it, and brought it into the logic of governance. He encouraged its leaders, shaped its public doctrine, and allowed its symbols to merge with imperial authority. Step by step, he transformed a persecuted faith into the sacred framework of a civilization, not in one decree, not in one sermon, but through a series of choices so consequential that the ancient world never recovered from them. Because in the end, Constantine did not simply ask Rome to accept Christianity. He asked Christianity to inherit Rome, and once that inheritance began, nothing remained untouched, not the empire, not the church, not the meaning of power, and not the future of the West. The throne would never again feel entirely secular. The altar would never again feel entirely powerless. Between them, a new world was born. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this journey into the moment when faith and empire became one of history's most powerful alliances, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us which other turning point of religion and power you would like to explore next. And remember, sometimes the most important battles in history are not only fought over land or crowns, but over the stories that give rulers the right to rule. See you in the next video.